Okay, so I'm now going to talk briefly to the camera since my husband just started the camera, and this is the lecture on torture. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was an email I just sent you guys concerning the fact that that the AMA actually early on condemned the participation of doctors in torture. But after the information came out on what had happened and how the CIA had been involved in torture, those memorandums that came out by Congress, you'll recall, I guess that was either a year or two ago, I've lost track. In any event, the AMA then once again reaffirmed the fact that it opposed the participation of doctors in torture, even though that report showed clearly that doctors were in fact involved. For instance, you probably heard about feeding, anal feeding, which had to have been done by medical doctors. There was also apparently an instance where doctors told the CIA how long they thought it was possible for somebody whose feet were broken to stand up during so-called enhanced interrogation. So I think it's become increasingly difficult to argue that what was done to the people who were taken prisoner or who were detained, however you care to put it, during both the Afghani and the Iraqi wars was not torture. Plainly, it was, and moreover, it was not. Most of what we're going to be discussing today is psychological torture, but plainly what they described was straight up physical torture. I should also note that if you've looked at your readings, as you already know, Barack Obama said the United States is no longer going to participate in torture. And whether that is what's actually happened or not, I could not say. Got to turn up the contrast here. Looks a little weird. Brightness. Let's see what happens. Okay. Anyway, Barack Obama has clearly stated he did not want to have the United States government participate in torture, but as you also know, we have this bizarre outcome that rather than detaining people, we just kill them straight up. So no problem with the torture issue anymore. Then the question, of course, becomes, is torture, as between torture and death, which would you prefer? And certainly what we can say is, depending on how horrible the pain is that's being inflicted, there are people who would reply death would be superior to torture. So I don't know how you evaluate that ethically or morally, but basically that's where things stand. You also probably know, going back to our discussion of rape in Serbia, that the UN has decided to view rape as being a form of torture as well. Or some people have called it rapes, so killing. Certainly we know that the impact on individuals who have been subject to rape is pretty much lifelong. People certainly learn to function again, but they don't necessarily entirely recover. So it's a terrible thing as well. Finally, I just wanted to direct your attention to the additional article I sent you, which was, I believe, from Wikipedia, that is to say. I'm just going to turn to it briefly. Let's see. I think we can close this. Are you guys still there? I just closed a little thing. I don't know what the impact is. Okay, so I didn't lose you. Okay, hi there, Luis. So, in addition, in the wiki article I sent you, I actually had somebody write a master's thesis on this issue. The APA, that is the American Psychological Association, was sort of the last to come around to the view that their participation, psychologists' participation in torture was also a bad thing. And that only happened on February 2010. when the Council of Representatives voted to amend the Association's Code of Ethics to make clear that its standards can never be interpreted to justify or defend violating human rights. Following are the two ethical standards and the changes adopted. Language that is in bold was newly adopted. First ethical standard is 1.02, conflicts between ethics and law, regulations, or other governing legal authority. If psychologists' ethical responsibilities conflict with law, regulations, or other governing legal authority, psychologists clarify the nature of the conflict, make known their commitment to the ethics code, and take reasonable steps to resolve the conflict consistent with the general principles and ethical standards of the ethics code. Under no circumstances may this standard be used to justify or defend violating human rights. Then follows 1.03, conflicts between ethics and organizational demands. If the demands of an organization with which psychologists are affiliated or for whom they are working are in conflict with the ethics code, psychologists clarify the nature of the conflict, make known their commitment to the ethics code, and take reasonable steps to resolve the conflict consistent with the general principles and ethical standards of the ethics code. Under no circumstances may this standard be used to justify or defend violating human rights. So what I think is really interesting about that is they don't actually, say specifically, we're not going to engage in torture anymore. But at least they say that we're not going to violate human rights, which I guess is a broader category and inclusive of torture, one hopes. Anyway, you guys, I hope, read A Question of Torture by Alfred W. McCoy. It's interesting because I originally thought that the book was written by a journalist, but recently this gentleman came to the NYU campus and it was represented that in fact he is a historian. So I will take them at their word. I've never had occasion to look up his credentials specifically. Somebody might do that. Excuse me, it is right there on the dust cover. He's the J.R.W. Small Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So there you have it. Okay, so I should have known that. If I'd only opened up that part of the book, I would have known. In any event, I just wanted to start with how far back the nonviolent techniques of torture associated with the CIA go. There is a book, I don't know if anybody has read it, called The Little Drummer Girl. It was a spy novel by John le Carré, published in 1983. It was later made into a movie featuring Diane Keaton, who was in the title role of The Little Drummer Girl. It was effectively an apology, and by apology I mean in the sense of formal justification for the use of psychological torture, as it was then practiced by Israel and has been practiced by the United States throughout the Cold War era, and more recently, of course, as we know, during the War on Terror. Now, as you also know from McCoy's book, psychologists were intimately involved in developing this form of torture. Hence, I think they were slow. 2010 is pretty late in this story to finally come forward and say, yes, we do not believe in participation in torture. In any event, the argument in defense of psychological torture in The Little Drummer Girl was very much like that for lethal injection as a means of execution. As psychological torture was developed by psychologists, lethal injection was developed by medical doctors, which of course they also now maintain that they will no longer participate in. But both were done on the theory that it was more humane. I'd like to pause to note that the reality as to lethal injection is that it merely appears more humane to the observer. The fact of the matter is that the first injection that the person who is about to be killed receives is a paralytic agent, and then there are 2 additional injections that finally bring about the person's death. And of course, when the paralytic agent fails, you will see the individual thrashing about in horrible pain. But if the paralytical agent works, of course, the person is perfectly calm, or appears to be so to the observer. So it is not at all clear that there's anything humane about lethal injection. It just makes us feel better. Similarly, psychological torture, it is argued, is more humane because you are not bloodying the person up. You're just messing with his mind. Needless to say, once again, if you are destroying somebody cognitively, if you were destroying somebody emotionally, if you were destroying somebody's capacity to operate as a human being from a psychological point of view, it is not at all clear that that is a lesser form of torture than physical torture. In any event, I'd also like to stop to point out as a historical note that lethal injection was also used by the Nazis in their T4 euthanasia program as one of several methods to destroy life unworthy of life. As McCoy discusses at length, the impact of psychological torture is far from humane. It breaks many people not for a day or a week or a month, but in fact for life. So what is the phenomenology of torture? First of all, of course, is the establishment of the asymmetry of power. Plainly, the person who is being tortured, it is impressed upon them that they are absolutely weak, that they have absolutely no ability to defend themselves, that they cannot leave, they cannot oppose what is being done to them, that merely they can survive. And then, of course, possibly not even that, because there is always the underlying threat that either you will be killed or in some cases your loved ones will be killed. 2, the anonymity of the torturer, of course. The reality is that the torturer is somebody that the victim does not know and will not be permitted to come to know in any meaningful way. The third point is that there's a double bind for the victim of having either to endure pain or betray others. And of course this is just as true for physical torture as it is for mental torture. But the reality is that it's inconceivable to endure pain for an indefinite period of time, and frankly, it doesn't matter how strong you are, how smart you are. The reality is that no one can, in fact, endure pain indefinitely, and so they end up. Or most people ultimately end up giving some kind of information. Sometimes it's pure falsehoods, but also people may, in fact, tell the truth in connection with their compatriots, or in connection with their compatriots. The fourth point is the use of systematic falsehoods, of trumped-up charges, artificial lighting, cunning deceptions, and mock executions, in particular waterboarding. Now, as you know, waterboarding is actually a physical form of torture, so it is not at all clear why he deems it to be a part of the psychological form of torture we're talking about primarily today. But in any event, the reality is that waterboarding isn't actually supposed to kill you if done correctly, as if there was a correct way to do this, but rather is to make you feel as if you were about to die. The fifth point is confinement in distinctive spaces signifying displacement, trapping, narrowness, and destruction. So you're given small spaces, usually dark spaces, and so inevitably, certainly you feel trapped, but I'm sorry, I'm missing the word when you also, of course, are going to experience extreme claustrophobia as well. The sixth point is temporality, which is characterized by some unpredictability, much circularity, and having no end. One of the things that they do, go to great lengths to do, is completely confuse you as to what time it is. So the space that you're going to be confined in is not merely small, but usually it's also dark, so that you have no way of assessing whether it's night or day, what time of the day it might be. You are completely disassociated from any normal conception of time, the passage of time. And because of that, of course, among other things, you are left with the impression that this is not likely ever to end. And in some cases, as we've seen, particularly with the people who've been kept at Guantanamo Bay, there's reason to believe that's really true. There will be no end to what is happening to them. Number 7. As a result, the victim forms emotional ties to his or her tormentors that make him or her more responsive and leave the victim psychologically damaged for the rest of their lives. As you undoubtedly know, the same kind of attachment is often seen in abducted hostages who start showing signs of loyalty to their hostage taker, regardless of the danger in which the hostage has been placed. This is also, it's even possible that the hostage may ultimately defend the hostage taker after being released. The same phenomenon is actually observable among abused children towards their abusive parents. Strangely, no matter how horrific the abuse may be, particularly in small children who are unable to identify what is actually being done to them, there is substantial distress if you try to take the child from the abusive parent. And of course, all of this is known and documented as the Stockholm Syndrome. So the question then becomes, why torture? And I should note, this is a particularly interesting subject. I provided you with statistics. They're not extremely current, but statistics that suggest that overwhelmingly Americans support torture. So what is it about torture that is so appealing to those who would torture as opposed to those who are being tortured? Well, obviously, the first and foremost, it actually makes the perpetrator feel omnipotent. It is most often used in times of suspicion and fear, like the Cold War. And one can see that while the kind of threat that is presented by terrorists is certainly not near the level of the kind of threat that was presented by the Cold War, nonetheless, it is interesting that people find it or become as paranoid as they did during the Cold War, because we start talking about sleeper agents, which was a Cold War phenomenon that too has been documented and verified. The possibility that the guys, sitting next to you, who on the bus or subway, or your next door neighbor, whoever, however nice they may appear to be, in fact might actually end up committing an act of violence that we would call terror. So once torture is permitted, it inevitably spreads like a virulent cancer. Psychological torture appears to be an especially effective means of information extraction. Moreover, because it is, at least in its purest form, a non-touch method, it has the patina of acceptability. Once again, I go back to the comparison with lethal injection. It looks better. And so we feel as if we are moral if we participate. Indeed, many don't even recognize it as torture, even though psychologists did early in the game. The very ones who made this form of torture up created it. And the ICRC and a plethora of human rights groups agree that it is. So how did psychological torture originate? The oddity of the CIA developing psychological torture is that, at least in its first instance, it made no rational sense. In a letter that wasn't unlike the Einstein-Sizzler letter written to FDR in 1939, and signed by Albert Einstein, in which Einstein advised Roosevelt that Nazi Germany might be conducting research into the atomic bomb, and suggested the United States should do the same. A very similar letter was written in connection with mental techniques of mental control, manipulation, what have you. And it was written by a Yale psychologist, Irving L. Janis, who warned the intelligence community that a war was being waged on the frontiers of cognitive science, and that we in the United States needed to catch up. Now, the concern was that the Soviets were able to extract public confessions in ways that hinted at secret mind control methods. Now, one may ask, what in the world did the United States need this for? Why would America need mind control methods to extract public confessions, which we in fact knew were false? Was it our quest to force capitalists to falsely confess that they were really communists? In any event, As McCoy describes at length, this concern led the CIA down the road to two key areas: methods of mass persuasion, which, by the way, many people were really fearful of. I'm sure you guys have all heard about the deal where they used to have, like, you'd be in a movie theater, they'd throw up a single screen of say, Coke, and then they would observe what people would do in response to having seen a screen unconsciously, because it went up so fast and came down so quickly that you couldn't consciously see it or observe it. And what would be the impact? Well, of course, the impact was everybody ran out of the theater during intermission and they bought Cokes. Anyway, so this, of course, when the public became aware that, these kinds of tests were being done on them, they, of course, became fearful and paranoid. And, well, obviously buying a Coke is not the worst and most horrible thing that ever happened to someone, although my husband, the health nut, might disagree with me. Still, the very fact that this could be done to them freaked people out. Anyway, the second road that the CIA went down was the coercion of individual consciousness. Now, eventually mass persuasion resurfaced in the legitimate arena of diplomacy and scholarly study. People are probably aware of the concept of public diplomacy. At the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which I attended, public diplomacy was a whole separate program. And also, of course, scholarly study. But the coercion of individuals then went underground. McCoy suggests that even the Milgram experiment that established that anyone could be persuaded to torture was in fact part of the CIA's pursuit of a method of psychological torture. Does anybody know anything about the Milgram experiment? Luis, I'm betting on you. What?
Administering electric shocks.
Okay, but there's more to it, because no electric shocks were actually administered, right? Okay. The Milgram experiment on obedience to authority figures was a series of social psychology experiments conducted by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram. They measured the willingness of study participants, men from a diverse range of occupations, with varying levels of education, to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. The experiment found unexpectedly that a very high proportion of people were prepared to obey, albeit unwittingly, even if apparently causing serious injury and distress. Milgram first described his research in 1963 in an article published in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, and later discussed his findings in greater depth in his 1974 book, Obedience to Authority: An Experimental View. Now, these experiments began in July 1961 in the basement of Lindsley Chittenden Hall at Yale University, 3 months after the start of the trial of German Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Milgram devised his psychological study to answer the popular question at that particular time: could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? The experiments have been repeated many times in the following years with consistent results within differing societies, although not with the same percentages around the globe. So the experiment itself, 3 individuals were involved: the one running the experiment, the subject of the experiment who was a volunteer, and a Confederate who was pretending to be a volunteer. These 3 people filled 3 distinct roles. The experimenter was the authority figure. The teacher was a role intended to obey the orders of the experimenter, and the learner who was the recipient of stimulus from the teacher. Now, the subject and the actor both drew slips of paper to determine their roles, but unknown to the subject, both slips said teacher. The actor would always claim to have drawn the slip that read learner, thus guaranteeing that the subject would always be the teacher. Now, at this point, the teacher and learner were separated into different rooms where they could communicate but not see each other. In one version of the experiment, the Confederate was sure to mention to the participant that he had a heart condition. Now, at some point prior to the actual test, the teacher was given a sample electric shock from the electroshock generator in order to experience firsthand what the shock that the learner would supposedly receive during the experiment would feel like. The teacher was then given a list of word pairs that he was to teach the learner. The teacher began by reading the list of word pairs to the learner. The teacher would then read the first word of each pair and read 4 possible answers. The learner would press a button to indicate his response. If the answer was incorrect, the teacher would administer a shock to the learner, with the voltage increasing in 15-volt increments for each wrong answer. If correct, the teacher would read the next word pair. The subjects believed that for each wrong answer, the learner was receiving actual shocks. In reality, there were no shocks. After the Confederate was separated from the subject, the Confederate set up a tape recorder integrated with the electroshock generator, which played pre-recorded sounds for each shock level. After a number of voltage level increases, the actor started to bang on the wall that separated him from the subject. After several times banging on the wall and complaining about his heart condition, all responses by the learner would cease. At this point, many people indicated their desire to stop the experiment and check on the learner. Some test subjects paused at 135 volts and began to question the purpose of the experiment. However, and this is the most important aspect, most continued after being assured that they would not be held responsible. A few subjects began to laugh nervously or exhibit other signs of extreme stress once they heard the screams of pain coming from the learner. If at any time the subject indicated his desire to halt the experiment, he was given a succession of verbal prods by the experimenter in this order. First, please continue. Second, the experiment requires that you continue. Third, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And fourth, you have no other choice, you must go on. If the subject still wished to stop after all 4 successful verbal prods, the experiment was halted. Otherwise, it was halted after the subject had given the maximum 450-volt shock 3 times in succession. Notably, of course, at that level of electricity, the person would be dead. The experimenter also gave special prods if the teacher made specific comments. If the teacher asked whether the learner might suffer permanent physical harm, the experimenter replied, although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage, so please go on. If the teacher said that the learner clearly wants to stop, the experimenter replied, whether the learner likes it or not, you must go on until he has learned all the word pairs correctly, so please go on. And lastly, if the teacher asked who is responsible for any negative effects, the experimenter replied, I will take responsibility. Before conducting the experiment, blah, 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 I just want to get to what the outcome was. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Okay, Yale University senior year psychologist majors predicted the behavior of 100 hypothetical teachers. All of the poll respondents believed that only a very small fraction of teachers, the range was from 0 to 3 out of 100 with an average of 1.2, would be prepared to inflict the maximum voltage. And similarly, Milgram's colleagues believed the same. He also reached out to other institutions with basically the same outcome in terms of what they believed would happen. In any event, in Milgram's first set of experiments, 65%, that is 26 out of 40 people, of experiment participants administered the experiment's final massive 450-volt shock. Though many were very uncomfortable doing so, at some point every participant paused and questioned the experiment. Some said they would refund the money they were paid for participating in the experiment. Throughout the experiment, subjects displayed varying degrees of tension and stress. Subjects were sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, groaning, digging their fingernails into their skin, and some were even having nervous laughs, laughing fits, or seizures. Notably, the APA condemned on ethical grounds this particular experiment and others like that eventually. So it's strange on the theory that the subject was being harmed. And also relying upon a canon of ethics that had been developed in response to the kind of experimentation that had occurred in Nazi Germany. So it's even odder then that it took them so very long to reach a point where they condemned torture as well. Then we move on to MK Ultra. It seems to hold a particular fascination because it was a horror story. It included research into esoteric methods of mind control through drugs such as LSD, electroshock, hypnotism, and sensory deprivation. It's interesting that some years later, sensory deprivation and LSD actually became a fad. People thought that by using a hallucinogen and being in a sensory deprivation tank, which is basically an enclosed sort of coffin-like thing where you were in water, maintained at a certain temperature so you're not uncomfortable, and so you're floating in this water and you have no light and no sound, and you are experiencing the effects of LSD. They thought that was very cool, and that somehow that opened up your mind to new spiritual planes, blah blah blah. Anyway, amusingly enough, at about the same time that all of this was happening, experts concluded that the mind control that the Soviets were using was the same kind of mind control that the Tsars used. And that is good old-fashioned physical torture. So they were not doing anything new. We were, as it turns out. But even though the original cause evaporated, such as it was, the CIA continued its search for the ideal form of psychological torture. Now, of course, the yucky part, anybody know what behavioralism is? I'm sorry, I think it's grotesque. I puke every time I encounter the entire concept. But does anybody know what behavioralism is? Brittany, you familiar with it?
Unfortunately, no.
Mr. Varone? He's hiding. Danielle!
No, sorry, I don't know what
Okay. Okay, so I will go on and I'll explain behavioralism to some greater or lesser degree as we move forward. Anyway, it was here that the CIA moved into behavioralism. And for those who aren't initiated in basic psychology, behavioralism is to many, as it is to me, an unethical grotesquerie. It regards humans as mere organisms, black boxes, to be consciously manipulated through a series of positive, the carrot, and negative, the stick reinforcements. Now, basically what we know, or what we should know in the absence of telepathy, because obviously if telepathy exists, that would entirely contradict the claim. But basically, if I look at you, Danielle, which I can't because you don't have your camera on, but anyway, if I look at you, there is no way for me to know whether you are thinking short of the existence of telepathy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I cannot know, indeed, even if you think. So to me, you are a black box, right?
I guess.
And since I can have no direct knowledge of whether in fact you think, my conclusion is you do not think. You are not, thought is, and in fact behavioralism basically reached the conclusion that to the degree that consciousness exists, it is a strange evolutionary phenomenon having no particular value to the survival of organisms like ourselves, and that in fact, we are basically automatons, and the computations that our brains carry out, in fact, are not reflective of our conscious mind, but rather our conscious mind is reflective of the computations that our brain carries out. Moreover, our conscious mind cannot have any impact on the world, only the black box can. So anyway, so we regard then humans as mere organisms that are black boxes, and so what we want to do is we want to alter the behavior of the organism with permanent permanently alter, I should say, the behavior of that organism through quote-unquote learning. Now, you have probably heard, the whole notion that scientists always throw at people who claim that animals, cats and dogs, are companion animals, among others, have the ability to think. And their response is, well, you are anthropomorphizing animals. The only thing you ever see is learned behavior. What they do not add is, by the way, you're a black box too. You're a non-thinking organism as well. And your learned behavior in no way differentiates you from any other animal, which of course makes sense if you also happen to embrace evolution. And I could go on about that, but basically the argument is a false argument. It's a straw man, because all behavior, according to behavioralists, is learned behavior, whether you're a human or you're an animal, or ultimately, if you're evolutionist, you are an animal in any event. So, it does not assume then that indeed it rejects the notion, as I've already said, that sentience or consciousness plays any role in human behavior. And of course this leads to this very strange incongruity. Anybody see what the incongruity is, logically speaking? You are not a self-directed being as a product of your conscious mind. So what is the problem with this modality of thought? Somebody in the room is assuming that they are a self-directed individual who operates as a product of their conscious mind. Who would that be? Oh, come on, guys. The psychologist, right? So the psychologist who's experimenting on you is self-directed, but you are not. You merely react. So to make sense then of behavioralism, we must assume that the one doing the manipulation is in fact engaged in purposefully directed behavior, which in turn suggests that he or she, unlike his or her subject, possesses sentience. It is still broadly, so do you see the ethical problem that this presents? Why it would enable behavioralists to disregard human rights? What is the behavioralist doing? People, come on, respond.
They think they're shaping the thoughts of others, so if they think something is appropriate and it violates the rights of the black box, then they'll do it.
Okay, but what are they really saying about the black box?
That maybe it doesn't have the same rights as they would as a psychologist.
Okay, but more. What are they doing? What are they saying about the black box? You, their quote-unquote patient. Are you equal to them? What, Brittany?
Is there an assumption that they aren't human?
I think that's fair to say, of course. Absolutely. That you, my patient, are not human, I am. I am the only human in this room. In any event, it is still broadly used to teach, quote-unquote, persons of who possess low intelligence quotients, and also persons who are suffering from acute mental illnesses. So to be effective, even in its most benign form, where you can assume that the practitioner is actually trying to help someone. But even in its most benign form, it has to be practiced surreptitiously, because the moment that the subject becomes aware of the manipulation, the putridness of it becomes quite apparent, even to a person possessing a low IQ. At least, I should say, to the subject, if not to the practitioner. So what's really great about behavioralism is how effective it is as a means of torture. So let's take a brief break. We started at 1. Let's get back in 10 minutes and we'll continue, okay?
Okay.
Did you guys leave?
I'm still here.
Oops.
Yep, here.
Okay. Everybody else? So we had 4 participants, right? Okay, so here we are then. Who else is here? Selena, you here? Oops. Danielle? Luis is here. Danielle? I guess they're away. Okay, Mr. Luis, you said, hi, I can't really use the mic. I might have to leave abruptly, but otherwise present. Smiley face. Okay, so anyway, back to where we were. I know I'm starting a little bit early, but I want to move us along. So here we are then with this whole concept of behavioralism and its sort of inherent ugliness. Did anybody ever read the book by B.F. Skinner? I believe it's called, did he write another, did he also call it by the same name as Thoreau? Trying to remember. Oh, he called it Walden 2. That's what he called it. Not on Walden Pond, but Walden 2. And of course it was his position that in fact behavioralism was a really wonderful thing. And he also, has anybody ever heard of the Skinner box? That was where you put a child in a box and you keep it isolated, and somehow that was supposed to be an aid to the child's development. Does anybody know what actually happens if you leave a child without physical touch? The child actually withers and dies. Children actually have to be touched and stimulated through holding very much the same way that, well, they simply have to be at least in the early months and even years of their existence after birth. So anyway, let's talk about building a system of psychological torture. It all began with isolation chambers of various kinds, of the sort that I previously discussed, that is to say, excuse me, the water tanks that were intended to isolate people from all kinds of stimuli. It was discovered that if a person was completely isolated, even in relatively pleasant circumstances, they would literally go nuts. It turned out that we, like babies, have to have the stimulation of a constantly changing sensory environment. If someone is isolated for a sufficiently long time, they become malleable and they desire to talk even to their tormentors. The second key element that the CIA psychologists discovered was self-inflicted pain. Whereas physical violence is often counterproductive, causing a person to engage in behaviors like standing for hours together with isolation, anxiety, lack of sleep, uncomfortable temperature, and chronic hunger made the victim extremely compliant. But the worst part of it, and part of the reason why, of course, this ends in psychological breaks, is that they even began to feel guilt because they felt as if they had participated in their own torture by engaging in apparently self-inflicted pain. And of course the final element was provided by Milgram, and that was that anyone is capable of torturing another human being. So the notion that only psychopaths or sociopaths, whichever word you want to use, would behave in such a manner is simply false. And so this whole notion that, every German during the period of the Third Reich was actually prepared, to participate in the Holocaust of their free will is not at all clear. They were merely reduced to compliance largely through the use of fear, obviously propaganda, and also this notion that they were merely implementing the orders of their superiors. So, what is the stated purpose of psychological torture? The purpose of the CIA method was to induce regression of the personality to a level of weakness that was necessary for the dissolution of resistance and the inculcation of dependence. So the first step was to deprive the prisoner of the ability to keep track of time, as I've already said, by depriving them of regular meals and sleeping patterns. Prisoners were kept in dark cells that eliminated all sensory stimuli, and of course, as I've also said, these cells were also very small. The torturer then attacks the victim's personal identity with personal or sexual humiliation. Everybody, of course, remembers the pictures from Abu Ghraib, which was the ultimate achievement in sexual humiliation. Threats of the infliction of pain follow. Sometimes actual physical pain has to be inflicted to make the threats credible. Hence the use of waterboarding, which of course is a very effective means because it carries with it the threat of death. So then the torture moves on to self-inflicted pain, for instance, forcing the victim to stand with his or her arms extended. Again, looking back at the pictures of Abu Ghraib, you will notice that all of the people in those pictures had their arms extended and were standing. The Brits added hooding for the hooding deal for purposes of torturing IRA suspects. It creates further isolation because you then have no eye contact with your tormentor. The best part of psychological torture is that, of course, it leaves no physical marks. Hence, once again, people who engage in psychological torture do not feel as if they have done anything quite so evil as if they had beaten the crap out of somebody, although, all things considered, perhaps beating the crap out of somebody might have been kinder. Anyway, so dissemination. These methods were disseminated around the world during the Cold War, especially to our Third World allies. It was so simple that it only took a handbook, or so McCoy claims. Rose, on the other hand, who wrote the book about Gitmo, argued that actually it maintains that it takes extensive training. Other of our authors take the position that a good torturer has to be produced by an institutionalization of torture, or else he or she won't have the training to do the job. The unhappy truth is that rather than supporting regimes, it actually undermines them. Does anybody know why it would undermine a regime? Once you say torture's okay, what problem does that introduce?
Isn't it just like the people have nothing left to lose, and so they start fighting back against their government that's torturing them?
Okay, that's one possibility. What else? Consider, I'm talking in specific about the people who have been trained to torture. Why does this not support the regime but ultimately undermine it?
By allowing to be omnipotent, they can also start to rebel against their own government that has given them that power.
Okay, you're going down the right line. Continue.
Well, I know in one of the cases, for instance, I can't remember which country, I wish I did, they started to allow torture. The U.S. was training people to torture in this country, and then that group decided, the group of torturers decided that they would become their own faction, and so it ended up causing civil war, because the group, the whatever, was it the RUF? It empowered the military in such a way that they became unstoppable.
I think that's exactly right. So what happens then is that when someone lower in the pecking order is required, someone higher in the pecking order to torture them, what happens is that that person then discovers they have this, as you said, basically omnipotent power, and that over a person who is highly placed, and then of course the sky becomes the limit. So ultimately, since torture itself is inherently unethical, and since you've been trained to believe that an inherently unethical act is acceptable, then of course there is no limit to how you might use it. Now, psychological torture in the global war on terror. We know the story of Guantanamo, and we don't have to go through it all again. We also know the methods developed at Guantanamo were transferred to Abu Ghraib with some special twists. Women were used to torture Islamic men because it was particularly demeaning to them in light of their culture. They were stripped of their clothes, they were forced to perform or at least simulate sexual acts inconsistent with Islamic beliefs, and they were subjected to terrorization with dogs, which, as it turns out, most Islamic jurists regard as being unclean. Even demons. I should also note, actually, that this is probably a pre-existing belief system prior to, that is to say, Islam. Whether Muhammad really deemed dogs ritually unclean, it is apparently a subject of dispute, because some Sunnis seem to suggest that if he didn't much like them, as apparently he is supposed to have loved cats, he at least did not think that they should be treated poorly. In any event, what about the torture memos? We've already discussed you guys at least have read about the torture memos to some degree, that were produced by the DOJ in connection with their application at Gitmo. It sent soldiers in the field as well as CIA operatives down a slippery slope. There's a quote, if you happen to have your book on torture, on page 124 through 125, I'm going to read for you. Okay, so this is at the bottom of 124 and it runs into 125. In the next few years of the war on terror, the toll from President Bush's orders is conveyed in these memos and others still secret, at least at the time of his writing, would be chilling. Some 14,000 Iraqi security detainees subjected to harsh interrogation, often with torture, 1,100 high-value prisoners interrogated with systematic torture at Guantanamo and Bagram, 150 extra-legal renditions of terror suspects to nations notorious for brutality, 68 detainees dead under suspicious circumstances, some 36 top Al-Qaeda detainees held for years of sustained CIA torture, and 26 detainees murdered under questioning, at least 4 of them by the CIA. Adding to the casualties from this covert war, Bush hinted at torture and extrajudicial execution during his State of the Union address in January 2003, when he spoke about the 3,000 suspected terrorists arrested in many countries, and many others have met a different fate. They are no longer a problem for the United States. To all these statistics, then, we should add another casualty, which was one great nation's international reputation. Now, what do you suppose he said that some people were no longer a problem for the United States? What do you do with torture victims when you're done?
You dispose of their body when they die?
I'm sorry, what, Brittany?
Did you say what do you do with them once you've killed a suspected terrorist?
Well, actually, what I was saying is, what do you do with a torture victim after you're done torturing them?
You send them over to a new country, another country.
Okay, but that's a problem because you don't really want it to come to light that you've really committed torture. So what do you do instead?
Kill them.
Obviously. Hence, he talks later in the book about the whole pump and dump aspect of torture in Vietnam. And of course, in that case, they intentionally dumped bodies near the villages where the individuals were taken from, in order to not only to effectuate terror vis-a-vis that community, which knew whose body it was. In any event, when it came to light as a result of the notorious photos at Abu Ghraib shown around the world, there was, of course, a great deal of buck passing. The White House and DOJ disclaimed the torture memos, while at the same time suggesting that sometimes coercive methods of interrogation were required by exceptional circumstances. And of course, that really is the ticking bomb scenario, which I failed to note in my notes where it was located. So let me see if I can find it. Hang on. The ticking bomb scenario is, of course, central to the claim. Here we go. Is central to the claim that the torture actually is important and must be preserved or be an available technique to people. And this quote is from page 191. Starts about midway down the page. What is the ticking bomb case? Indeed, the professor intones this question is a venerable one. Of course, at this point, they are talking about a particularly famous Harvard Law School professor, Alan Dershowitz, who also notably is a criminal defense attorney. Hence, he would be deeply involved in opposing coerced confessions among criminals. In any event, so he goes on, he says, what about the ticking bomb case? Indeed, the professor intones, this question is a venerable one, confronted by many philosophers, including Michael Walzer, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Jeremy Bentham. So in its current variation, the ticking bomb scenario, Dershowitz says, usually involves a captured terrorist who refuses to divulge information about the imminent use of weapons of mass destruction, such as a nuclear, chemical, or biological device that are capable of killing and injuring thousands of civilians. Speaking to Americans, he always asks, how many of you think that non-lethal torture would be used if we were ever confronted with a ticking bomb terrorist case? Hands always shoot up in near unanimity, although there is widespread disagreement about whether it should be used. From this hypothetical, Dershowitz segues, without skipping a beat, to the realm of reality. If torture is, in fact, being used and or would, in fact, be used in an actual ticking bomb terrorist case, would it be normatively better or worse to have such torture regulated by some kind of warrant? Answering his own carefully cooked question, Dershowitz warns from this land of make-believe to which his logic has now led us, that if we do nothing and a preventable act of nuclear terrorism occurs, then the public will demand that we constrain liberty even more. After this sleight of hand shift from the fictional to the real, Dershowitz concludes that his putative torture warrants would reduce the incidence of abuses, since high officials operating on the record would never authorize methods of the kind shown in the Abu Ghraib photos. If you go on to page 192, it goes on to say, in the real world, the probability that one terrorist would be captured in possession of the key information about a nuclear bomb in Times Square is so slender that the scenario seems an improbable foundation for law, diplomacy, and national security. Yes, there were terrorists who flew airplanes into the World Trade Center, and yes, the future may well bring us more terrorists with more bombs. But the precise mix of terrorist, bomb, and perfect prior information will never, in all likelihood, occur in the exact array to make the Times Square threat anything close to reasonable grounds for action. The fundamental flaw in this fanciful scenario is its pretzel-like ex post facto logic. It assumes the improbable, even impossible cluster of variables that run something like this. First, the FBI or CIA captures a terrorist. Second, the capture takes place at the precise moment between the plot's launch and the bomb's burst. Third, the interrogators somehow must have sufficiently detailed knowledge of the plot to know that they must interrogate this very person and do it right now. Fourth, this specific terrorist and his ticking bomb are, for some unexplained reason, missing just a few critical details that only torture can divulge. Put simply, this constellation of circumstances is so far-fetched that the logic of Dershowitz's argument is sophistic, if not spurious. So what do you think? Anyone? Notably, his defense counsel is particularly distressing that Alan Dershowitz, who is very, very highly regarded in the field, would make such a suggestion. Anyone?
When you're saying what do we think in general about the ticking bomb
Well,
scenario?
and also the idea that we should have warrants, we should legalize it, and then we can torture people by having first received a warrant from a court of law.
Well, I go back to, because Rose in the Guantanamo book mentioned the same thing, though he didn't go into as much length. and he talked about how there in the as far as he could tell, in the history of the world, in modern history, there's only been that scenario one time, and even then, the evidence that they got during the torture, they had before they started the evidence they found before they started torturing.
Is that not the case with the Pope? And I think the Pope was going to the Philippines.
Yes. Yeah, and so it's like, I mean, history has proven that this case doesn't exist, you know. And then in this book, McCoy, that's his name, right? McCoy.
That's
talks
correct.
about how once you legitimize torture once, like we've seen with Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, it just escalates very, very quickly and you can't contain it.
Okay, any other comments? Danielle, I'm willing to bet you have an opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think the warrant seems like a slippery slope, more so for the people, like the lower level interrogators on the ground, like we saw at Abu Ghraib, who would, you know, let's say if the ticking bomb scenario ever existed, which it seems like it never would, the people...
Except for on TV on 24, right?
Right, or a Batman movie. So it seems like the people who would maybe be... Or how would you even find the skilled interrogator in time to conduct the proper interrogation to get the correct information that you need to stop the bomb from going off? So it just seems like the people who would be on the ground in the moment of torture would be, who would even be skilled enough to get anything that wasn't just something false to stop the pain from happening. So besides being immoral and leading down a slippery slope, it doesn't even seem like you would be able to put together an effective situation to get the correct information from the person who knows about the bomb. So,
anyone else? Luis, I know that you're just chewing the bit. Come on. The only reason I can imagine he's quiet is because he's gone. There you go. He said he might have to leave abruptly. Aisha, you there?
Yes, I am.
What do you think?
I agree with Danielle that it's unlikely to happen. So legalizing or making rules about torture would be like it would be a slippery slope for. I mean, it would make torture illegal for a lot of countries and make them able to use it in circumstances where it wouldn't be necessary.
Right, because obviously you know once you have this instrument available to you, you're simply going to expand the purposes for which you use it, right?
Yeah.
That seems an inevitability, because if you happen to be an investigator and you want to prove your case for whatever reason against a particular individual, or get information to prevent an additional crime or terrorist act, then you're going to want to be able to have be able liberally to use this thing, right?
Yes, and also maybe the ticking time bomb could be used to describe other events that aren't necessarily as, like, if a situation isn't as urgent as the ticking time bomb, and the excuse of the ticking time bomb is given, then torture is also accepted for other situations.
So basically what we're talking about is the ticking time bomb scenario, even though according to most people who have studied it, is completely unrealistic, then it's a wedge issue, right? Because all of us are going to respond to the ticking time bomb scenarios thinking, oh gosh, remember what happened at the World Trade Center, oh my goodness, it was scary, blah, blah, blah. So the ticking time bomb scenario becomes a wedge issue that makes everything else permissible, right? Because once you open the door, once you say it's okay, then it's okay. You no longer have any sort of moral scruple about using torture. In any event, the CIA got their own lawyer to write them up a memo defending rendition, and then, of course, the CIA got out of town. I should back up a minute. The White House and DOJ disclaimed the torture memos, as I've already said. The CIA then defended extraordinary rendition, and then they sort of got out of the spotlight. Now, as we know, as time passed, the courts and more broadly civil society began to fight against the perception that torture was legitimate. But here's the interesting thing, and I recently saw this, what is the show? Not Criminal Intent. What is the show? McCoy. Not McCoy the author, but McCoy was the district attorney in the show.
Law and Order.
Thank you. So basically what happens is that McCoy sets up a case where he tries to address the illegitimacy of torture, and of course he is himself attacked because he is deemed to be giving quarter to the enemy and therefore is effectively a traitor. So what happened was that people who opposed the use of torture took them a long time to come out of the shadows because, of course, they were concerned that they would be deemed as traitors, and given the reality that there was some danger associated with being deemed a traitor, even from the general public, it took, as I said, it took a very long time to come out of the shadows. But so it only then really began this sort of civil society challenge to the use of torture after a sufficient time had passed since 9/11, and hence the courts, which quite clearly also opposed it, were no longer cowed by the merest mention. So the lawyers that wrote the various torture memos have all since been promoted, as you undoubtedly know, to positions including on the federal bench. The doctors, including psychiatrists that played a role in the torture, were deemed unethical by the American Medical Association. And then, as I've already said, ultimately the American Psychological Association followed suit. And somewhere around 2009, after years and years of debate, finally agreed that yes, this was something that they should oppose. Let's see, I think I already did that, yeah. Now, as I've said, McCoy says that in the real world, the impossibility of perfect prescience makes the plea to torture the few an opening to torture the many. Moreover, the logical corollary to state-sanctioned torture is state-sponsored murder. As we've already said, what do you do with the victim when you're done? If he is detained for a sufficiently long time, he is no longer valuable because he has no current information, so torture is no longer useful. So what happened is, as I've already mentioned, that in Vietnam, the CIA used the pump-and-dump approach. Now, we don't know what to do with our victims because no one is going for killing them. That is to say, our Gitmo folks. What do you do with them? We've almost certainly tortured them. If suddenly we clear out Gitmo, but we can't provide any information as to where we put these guys, what is the assumption that we did with them? Killed them, right? So, we already look bad enough. So if we add to the list, and then when we got all done, we killed them, doesn't look good. So people are reluctant to go there. At least so far. Now, mind you, there are certainly ways to make sure people die anyway, right? Kind of, are in the showers and they slip on a bit of soap and smack their head into a concrete wall and now they're dead. So, they could hasten their death without necessarily making it clear that they actually killed these people. According to a CIA vet, the truth was that the Phoenix program, that is the pump-and-dump program in Vietnam utilizing psychological torture, never led to the capture of a clear-cut, high-ranking VC agent, that is to say Viet Cong agent, Indeed, the Phoenix failed to crush the BC or to win the hearts and minds of the villagers. Well, gee whiz, I wonder why they weren't winning the hearts and minds of the villagers. Indeed, the most obvious outcome of using torture to stop either underground movements or terrorism is just to create bigger underground movements, as happened in Algeria during its War of Independence, or more terrorists, as is surely happening now. There is the FBI alternative. Anybody ever watched The Closer? It's on TNT. It's a pretty good rendition of what the FBI interrogation method is. It's not clear that that's entirely ethical either, because some of the things that are listed on the phenomenology of torture list, for instance, the systematic use of falsehoods, trumped up charges, artificial lighting, cunning deceptions, are all and have been officially deemed lawful according to the United States Supreme Court when interrogating a suspect. And in fact, we know with certainty, due to psychological research that has been underway for quite some time, the reality is that these behaviors, these behaviors result in false confessions. In any event, still, I think it's fair to say that the FBI's method is at least preferable to the CIA's method, and that is to talk to the prisoner as a human being and to establish a rapport with him or her using non-coercive methods. Not only is it purportedly much more successful in terms of yielding reliable intelligence, but it also produces evidence that bears scrutiny in a court of law. So let's go back to the issue that I raised before in connection with, I think when we were talking about the use of drones and killing people. What happens, let's suppose you go ahead and you decide to bring home a terrorist suspect and try him here in the United States. What's your first problem?
He can charge the United States, he or she can charge the United States for torture or inhumane treatment. Okay, so let us suppose that torture actually was used to get this, to either capture this person, or torture was used directly against this person. What's going to be a problem with your evidence?
It's thrown out.
Could be. Ouch, huh? So here you finally went to all the trouble to capture this person, and now you have evidence that is inadmissible. So that, of course, is why, you know, the use of the FBI alternative is preferable if you want, in fact, to prosecute somebody. So if you don't care about prosecuting them, then of course you just kill them and boom, problem over. So does torture work? What has long been known about torture is that the strong will never give up valuable intelligence, and as to the weak, they will say anything to make the pain stop, as somebody has already said. McCoy concludes that the powerful turn to torture in times of crisis not because it works, but because it salves their fears and insecurities with a psychic balm of empowerment. Does that seem real? Do you think it makes us feel better? Or is that why the American public says yay to torture?
I talked to my roommate about this, who's also from Texas, but even more rural Texas, and she said that verbatim that the reason why she supports torture is because it gives answers at terrorists. And so then I listened for about 20 minutes.
Brittany's on a campaign. Go ahead. So what did you say to her?
I gave her a lot of the evidence from, you know, that video I sent you from John Oliver, how he talks about the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on torture, specifically in Guantanamo, and how it has yet to produce results or produce information.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave her that. But anyways.
Did you convert her?
She's very Texan, so I think she's at least...
This is a very mixed thing with you, isn't it, about being Texan? It's your identity, but you have some issues with it.
Oh, yes. I'm very proud of it, but also very conflicted. But, yes, I think it definitely caused her to think otherwise, but she's not fully converted, if that makes sense.
Sure. So it gave her pause for thought. So that's always the first step.
Yeah.
So anybody have any ideas about what it is about the American public that we seemingly support torture? Is this something about our national character?
I mean, it's definitely shoved down our throats through the media, like you mentioned. Not only 24, but like there's a show right now about New York, and what is it? It has the girl, something Chopra. She's beautiful, Priyanka Chopra.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, and it's the same thing. Like there is a bomb that goes off in Grand Central, and then they know that another bomb is about to go off, and I don't know, like we're just taught that torture works and that this ticking bomb thing is real and it happens all the time, and that's not true.
Well, it certainly makes for great drama, right? I mean, you know, when you're watching a movie or watching a TV show, it moves quickly, and always to enhance the drama, we are presented with a situation, however unlikely, that we manage to move in like the Deus Ex Machina, and we manage to avert disaster just in the nick of time, right? So you certainly can understand why it's a great plot for a TV show, right? But the question is, do you think that the television and movie industry is trying to persuade us that in fact torture is okay, or do you think they just see it as a great plot device?
I think that it's just a great plot device. However, whenever I was reading the CIA book, he did mention that while it seemed like there was a TV show that was going on while the Bush administration was performing torture, and it was eerily similar, and it made it, in every episode he would torture an individual. It wasn't 24, but he would torture an individual, and then he would get an answer, and it would solve the problem. And so it just seemed like too much of a coincidence. But I think in general, it's just for the sake of the plot.
Anybody want to make the counter argument that in fact it's intentional propaganda?
Well, I'm thinking of like the movie Zero Dark 30, where, you know, there's images of waterboarding and torture, and I feel like the way sometimes torture is constructed specifically around the war on terror is that this is a special circumstance, and this is the only way that we can get the intelligence to stop, like, you know, kind of a bomb, like the bomb scenario, but on a larger scale, that these scenarios are happening all over, and like torture is the only thing. So I think there's like almost like a patriotism behind it, like we have to do these things because for the greater good. So I think that the way the war on terror, the way torture is associated with it, it's like, well, this is different. We don't do this otherwise. So I think. But
there's something unique about the circumstances of terrorism as opposed to any other set of circumstances, right?
Right.
And do you think that terrorism is so unique?
I mean, no, not for the sake of torture, but I mean, I think it's a different war in that it's not state versus state, but like we've just gone through, torture is not giving us the answers to stop bombs going off, and if anything, our actions are fueling fire in these other countries, especially, and you know, drone strikes, they're just kind of fueling hatred against the United States. So as far as solving the root issue of terrorism, we aren't doing a good job. So maybe it's different in that way, but we're totally missing what's really different, like the ideological aspect of the war.
Okay. So, excuse me. But the question, going back to Brittany's discussion about maybe it's just a plot device, certainly it can also be that. But the reality is, if you go back to World War II, for instance, movies and theaters were most definitely used to generate propaganda in support of the war effort. So do you really, and no doubt, I believe there's evidence to show that they were actually funded by the government. So do you think it is possible that the government, or at least allies to the government, are intentionally funding these kinds of dramas.
I think it's possible. I mean, I don't know how we find that out, but I would bet that some of these movies that are like, they're meant to show a side that shows the U.S. in a favorable light. Like, I think of like American Sniper. It kind of makes the U.S. see, like, puts us back on moral high ground. You know, like, this is why we do these things. So, but I mean, I don't know how you would go about proving the connection, or even like, I don't know. This is on a different subject, kind of, but that movie on Benghazi and the timing it came out during campaigns, sometimes I feel like the film industry definitely knows what it's doing for,
Right. So you think it's fair to at least allow, whether the government is directly involved or not, that many films come out with that are clearly politically motivated, right?
Definitely.
I mean, I think that's unavoidable. Now, the interesting part about it is, of course, Hollywood, like the media, is always accused of being liberal, but some of these movies, most definitely, no one would accuse them as being liberal propaganda. To the contrary, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, moving on to Alvarez, on torturing the law. And I think that this is particularly concerning. And that is, to him, the horror is that lawyers, whose job it is to limit the use of arbitrary power, at least in our system, have overseen the use of torture in the United States. The only way they could manage it was to torture the law to conform to their wishes. I'm gonna hang on just a second. I just want to make sure of something before I continue here. Where'd that go? Darn it. Yes. Okay. I'm coming back now. Here we are. Okay. So, before discussing this article, I should pause to note that the Military Commissions Act of 2006 included, if I can read my own writing, an amendment that retroactively rewrote the War Crimes Act, implementing the Geneva Conventions. It made both policy makers and those applying policy immune from prosecution for war crimes, including, guess what? Anyone? Torture, of course, yes. Now, the torture memos, as we know, the torture memos violated every conceivable Geneva Convention and Human Rights Convention, most especially the Torture Convention, which the DOJ maintained prevented only the most extreme forms of torture. Amazing, isn't it? I think if you read the Convention on Torture, you might come to a different conclusion. Moreover, the torture memos maintain that the prohibition only applies to interrogators if they have the specific intent to torture rather than elicit information to protect the nation. How do you like that culpable mental state? Let me read that again. They were only violating the convention, and it applied only to interrogators if they have the specific intent to torture rather than elicit information to protect the nation. See why that's just an amazing thing? Anyone? Danielle? You're still sitting there up on the top of my screen, so.
Because anyone would just say that they were torturing to get information. No, I mean.
Well, what other reason would they be torturing for the fun of it?
Right. Well, if they were doing that, they wouldn't say that. So then they would be within the provisions of this memo.
The confines of the law as it was so interpreted, right? I mean, the reality is that, I am sure there are sadists who actually enjoy the act of torture. And presumably such people would be excluded from the protection of the law. But overwhelmingly, the reason we say that we're torturing somebody is to get information, and the reason we say that we're trying to get information is to protect the nation. So who would not be protected by this interpretation? Anyway, further, even the ban on the most severe forms of harm was limited by necessity, that is, military necessities. Torture was likened to self-defense and was included among the president's war powers. The charming Betsy canon of interpretation established by the Supreme Court, that is to say, that an act of Congress ought never to be construed to violate the law of nations, if any other possible construction remains, was dismissed without further ado. So it basically, while we are not necessarily, directly bound, as Brittany would know, who was in my human rights class, although the United States is not directly bound by human rights conventions, the reality is, according to the Supreme Court, that we should not be interpreting a convention which we have ratified as being in a manner inconsistent with, or rather, we should not be interpreting a law, an act of Congress, in a manner that's inconsistent with a norm of international law by which we're bound. In fact, the torture memos violated virtually every provision of the Torture Convention. The torture, for instance, as to customary law, the torture memos rejected out of hand the notion that customary law could bind the executive or the military because it was not federal law. This interpretation again violated a Supreme Court precedent, this time the Paquet Habana, which integrated international customary law with U.S. law. It ignored the U.S. Torture Victim Protection Act. It ignored the fact that neither the determinations of U.S. courts nor the executive could excuse violations of international law, which create state responsibility. And you will recall that state responsibility means that we are liable to other states and to other persons abroad when we have violated international law. The torture memos did not consider that it was setting a precedent that other states might choose to rely on when dealing with U.S. citizens. The memos also ignored the U.S. War Crimes Act. They ignored the possibility that committing war crimes under Geneva Convention 3 and 4 would subject the perpetrators to prosecution by the ICC or by national courts outside of the U.S. under universal jurisdiction. The invocation of self-defense is not a cognizable defense to grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions or to the absolute ban on torture in the Torture Convention. As we know, a state can only invoke the right to self-defense under Article 51 when it has been attacked by another state. It is difficult to see how torturing a suspect can be deemed as the only means at a state's disposal to deal with an ongoing or imminent threat. The torture memos also appear to argue that the orders of the United States President protected soldiers in the field from violations of international law. First, the chain of command defense, as we know, has not been accepted since Nuremberg. Secondly, as we learned from the McCoy book, it was the soldier in the field that got hung out to dry. I believe that was also discussed in the Rose book as well. After Abu Ghraib, only the low-level soldiers involved in that particular event were in any way penalized. So no senior officers were held responsible, with the exception of one woman that then got demoted to colonel. Now here is, of course, the other interesting aspect of what happened in Abu Ghraib. Somebody who was knowledgeable about Islam and Muslim culture had to have been directing that behavior. Why?
Because they told them very specifically how to use women against the prisoners and how to use dogs against the prisoners.
Exactly. So they had to have been informed enough about Muslim culture to know how particularly to torch this particular class of victims, right? And how to be most effective. Now, what about the Goldsmith memo? Its purpose was to defend the practice of extraordinary rendition, as we've already said. Unlike the other torture memos, it appears to have been respectful of international law, and at least superficially it appears to be persuasive. However, Goldsmith's interpretation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention does not bear scrutiny. Article 49 of that convention provides individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power or to that of any other country, occupied or not, are prohibited regardless of their motive. Regardless of their motive. Nothing in Article 49 contains a sub silento exception for aliens. Indeed, the plain meaning of the article was to the contrary. When Article 49 was negotiated, the drafters specifically had in mind the prevention of tactics like the night and fog policies of the Third Reich. This involved a plan to combat resistance movements in occupied territories by deporting many thousands of civilian inhabitants of these territories. Because they disappeared without a trace, it had the additional effect of terrorizing those who were left behind. It was clear that Article 49 also addressed forcible removal of entire populations regardless of their legal status as aliens or citizens. It only permitted transfers to protect civilian populations and placed extensive conditions on such transfers that were intended to protect the evacuees. So the idea that Article 49 permits the forcible transfer of inhabitants of a territory for an unspecified time for purposes of interrogation what is and was utterly implausible. For anyone grounded in history, the claim that Article 49 intended to cut back on the provisions recognized at Nuremberg is utterly absurd. Numerous other treaty obligations of the U.S. also prevent such transfers, such as, of course, the Civil and Political Covenant, the Torture Convention, and the Refugee Convention, all of which we are party to. And finally, Alvarez goes through a long list of violations of the canon of ethics involved here by the authors of these torture memos, and I'm just going to mention one, and that is that it is both unethical and illegal for a lawyer to advise a client here in the United States how to commit a crime. And that is precisely what they were, in fact, doing, was advising the government and the members of the military how to commit a crime, aka torture. So once again, let's take a brief break. We have been at this for an hour and 40 minutes, give or take. And I guess we're going to have the full 2 hours, is that right? 2.5 hours, rather?
That's okay with me. I don't know.
What?
That's okay with me. I don't know about for them.
Is everybody good with 2.5 hours?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so let's take a brief break. I'll be right back. And we'll talk about Nadia Sadat. Thought I smelled a cleaning solution. Okay, so let's look at Ms. Sadat. You all there? Selena?
Yeah, I'm here.
Aisha? Not yet. Danielle?
Yes, I'm here.
Brittany? Oh, there she is. Okay, good enough. So let's look at extraordinary rendition specifically. Geneva law requires prisoners, including those taken in the war on terrorism, to be treated humanely. It forbids secret detention sites, and it appoints the ICRC as the international monitor for purposes of Geneva compliance. The White House chose to ignore memos from the State Department warning against extraordinary rendition in favor of the memos produced by the DOJ. Anybody see any problem with the DOJ being involved to begin with? This is not their bailiwick, right? In any event, the most common destination for the practice of extraordinary rendition was Egypt. Other renditions have been to Jordan, Syria, ironically, when one considers the current situation there, Morocco and Uzbekistan, notably all Islamic countries. In addition, other black sites included Thailand, Afghanistan, unnamed sites in Eastern Europe. I guess it's fairly recently come to light, including Poland, and of course Gitmo. She argues that the Torture Convention clearly prevents such renditions, in addition to the Geneva Conventions. It prevents transfer not only when the state knows that the individual so transferred will be tortured, it is also not permitted when the state to which the transfer is made is known to engage in gross human rights violations, including torture. Extraordinary rendition is not merely prohibited by the Torture Convention, but also by the Civil and Political Covenant, as it has been interpreted by the implementing body, that is, the Human Rights Committee. The Human Rights Committee and the Inter-American Court have condemned disappearances under various provisions of the American Human Rights Convention. Now, the Goldsmith memo that was written in support of the CIA's practice is particularly bewildering given the sharp criticisms both of the ICRC and of General Taguba of the CIA's practice of not reporting ghost detainees to the ICRC under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Indeed, Geneva law condemns it as a grave breach and therefore prosecutable under humanitarian law. The ICRC takes the position that Article 49 applies to the deportation of citizens and non-citizens alike. Moreover, the Rome Statute explicitly rejected Goldsmith's understanding of Article 49, that is, that the prohibition against deportation or forcible transfer does not apply to the ordinary deportation policies of the occupied states. The Preparatory Commission of the Statute of Rome found that the suggested requirement that a protected person must be transferred from his or her lawful place of residence, as is required for the crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer, is not an element of unlawful deportation or transfer as defined in the Geneva Convention. Article 45 of the Fourth Geneva Convention permits extradition of persons for ordinary crimes, but certainly would not permit torture. Indeed, the Nazis specifically deported foreign refugee Jews from Vichy France to extermination camps, and Article 49 was written with this and other activities of the Third Reich involved, or in mind. Now, what about the ticking bomb? We'll return there. We've already had a look at it, but Shu also writes about the ticking bomb. It is, as we already know, a hypothetical that assumes we know we have the right man. Now, how do we know that? From an epistemological point of view, how do we ever know if we have the right man? Anybody ever read about the problem of identification in connection with crimes committed in front of us? There is actually, and you probably could find it on 60 Minutes, a whole segment dedicated to the problem of identification. Anybody know what it is? The long and the short of it is we're bad at it. And we're especially bad at it if it's a cross-racial identification. We see somebody, you probably have watched, and this is at least accurate, although officers often assume that people are avoiding telling the truth, and that's why they can never get a straight answer about what a particular perpetrator looks like. And that is that people will, do not actually see the perpetrator because they are focused on the crime that's being committed. So particularly if there is a gun involved, they're going to be looking at the gun and not at the face of the perpetrator. There are a whole variety of reasons why we're really bad at identification. So what we do then when we have the ticking bombs hypothetical is we dispose of messy epistemological issues of uncertainty. And furthermore, in the ticking bomb scenario, the man who is being tortured quickly divulges the information before the bomb blows. Further, because we know we have the right man, we don't have to move on to the second best or third best or fourth best right man should we beat the right man senseless or to death while torturing him. And of course, the assumption here is also that only men get tortured, when in fact we know that women too are subject to torture. And of course, most commonly and most effectively, women are subject to torture by rape. Now, the ticking bomb scenario is, as we've already said, completely unrealistic. Moreover, once the practice of torture begins, it will not end. And it may further be expected that other states will feel at liberty to follow the U.S. lead. Indeed, one of the deepest concerns, not merely for, let's say, civil society, but for the military itself, is that we have now set this example, and when we were involved in future conflicts, we can expect our own soldiers to be subject to the same kind of treatment that we have dished out to the individuals we have detained during the course of this conflict. Xu denies another assumption of the ticking bomb scenario, and that is that the torturer will be a reluctant torturer. To the contrary, no such thing exists. He would fail to extract information effectively because to be effective, one must not have sympathy or empathy with the victim. Indeed, one must effectively be emotionless. What do we call someone who is inflicting terrible pain on another individual without empathy or sympathy, and indeed is emotionless?
Psychopath?
That's the word. So if the torturer is too angry, he will knock the suspect senseless and fail to extract any information at all. To be effective then, a torturer must have practice and training, and that means to be effective, torture must be institutionalized. And at that point, the suggestion of the rare, exceptional torture simply does not have a place in the world. Moving on to another ticking bomb discussion. Let's see. By the one by Guiora. I'm sorry, I'm probably not pronouncing that right. And Page. First, the basics. I think it's interesting to note that these authors are untroubled by enhanced interrogation methods in the name of self-defense, but nonetheless thought that the torture memos went too far. But first, the basics, and let's discuss what is human and SIGINT, and what is the distinction between the two.
Comment was the verbal interrogation, right? Yeah, person slave.
No, human intelligence, whereas SIGINT was like by the sky, right? Like by drones or satellites.
Right. So human is human intelligence. Is likely to be general information which may or may not be reliable. It is given by the informer either for remuneration or to wipe the slate clean. So obviously human is inherently unreliable, because this, generally when somebody provides human intelligence, they're doing it for some kind of gain and not because they feel they have a duty to report the information. As to SIGINT, which is also known as signal intelligence, it is received by a variety of listening devices strategically placed around the world. Obviously, the National Security Agent is primarily responsible for the gathering of electronic intelligence or signal intelligence. Now, what about interrogation? It is the creation of dependence of a suspect on the interrogator such that he feels comfortable telling the truth without resort to extra legal means. Now, this is different, obviously, from torture. Interrogation is something that, once again, we would expect the FBI to use. Torture is a whole other thing. While there is not an agreed upon definition of torture, I would differ with that. The authors would suggest anyway that there's not an agreed upon definition of torture, but as we know, McCoy believes that torture includes psychological torture. Webster's dictionary refers only to physical torture, however. The Torture Convention prohibits severe suffering, whether it is mental or physical, and it prohibits it absolutely. The U.S. reservation to the Torture Convention, on the other hand, requires specific intent, but it also agrees that psychological torture is prohibited. After the Bybee Memo, however, the armed forces followed suit by refining their definition of torture to include only physical or mental pain of such high intensity that it is difficult to endure. But if it was not at least of that intensity, what would the purpose be, right? I mean, you certainly want to create, sufficient stress that somebody is actually going to give up some information. Anyway, these authors claim, and of course McCoy denies, that the Philippines case was the real instance of the ticking bomb case, and that the torture succeeded. Brittany already made mention of this, but you'll find a discussion of it starting on page 109. It starts let's see, just want to see if it's worth talking, going back a little bit. Okay, such secondhand torture was evident at Manila in 1995 when the Philippine National Police, working with the CIA, discovered plans for a wave of trans-Pacific aircraft bombings. As the successor to the Philippines Constabulary, the PNP was the natural CIA ally, with clandestine ties dating back to the 1950s, including some exposure to agency torture training. In the post-9/11 media, this Manila incident, albeit distorted, was cited repeatedly to justify the use of torture, making it worth recounting it in some detail. In a security sweep before the Pope's 1995 visit, Manila police found bomb-making materials in the apartment of an Arab tourist, Abdul Hakim Murad. For 2 days, Murad taunted his captors at the PNP Intelligence Command until the police, in the words of a Filipino journalist, racing for time to protect the Pope, did what they did best to a prisoner at crunch time. After weeks of physical and psychological torture by beating, waterboarding, holding lighted cigarettes to his private parts, and threats of rape, all while he was blindfolded, Murad supposedly cracked and confessed to a plot to blow up 11 trans-Pacific aircraft and kill their 4,000 passengers and crew members. Although advised of the arrest, U.S. Embassy officials delayed Murad's extradition for months, while, as one Filipino officer put it, we did the dirty job for them. After 3 months in the hands of Filipino police, Murad, who evidently had been implicated in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was finally sent to New York City to face trial. After September 2001, a growing public consensus emerged in favor of torture. In October, the Washington Post reported impatience at the Federal Bureau of Investigation over the interrogation of 4 suspected terrorists arrested after 9/11. We're into this thing for 35 days and nobody's talking, said a senior FBI official, adding that frustration has begun to appear. With surprising frankness, the agent admitted that the FBI was considering torture. We are known for humanitarian treatment, but it could get to the spot where we would go to pressure, where we won't have a choice, and we are probably getting there. One law enforcement official suggested that the suspects to be extradited to Morocco, where, as everyone knew, the King's CIA-trained interrogators were notorious. A week later, the Los Angeles Times reported serious discussion of torture in intelligence circles. A lot of people are saying we need someone in the agency who can pull fingernails out, said one 30-year CIA veteran. Others are saying let others use interrogation methods that we don't use. The only question then is, do you want to have CIA people in the room? These musings inspired support for torture by media commentators spanning the political spectrum. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, the historian Jay Winnick, twisting the facts of Hakim Murad's Manila torture to portray the results as timely and valuable, asked what would have happened if Murad had been in American custody. In Newsweek, the columnist Jonathan Alter wrote, "In this autumn of anger, even a liberal can find his thoughts turning to torture." Citing the Filipino success with Murad, he added, "Some torture clearly works." Alter advocated psychological techniques or the transfer of suspects to our less squeamish allies. When a panelist on PBS's television McLaughlin Group asked fellow columnists whether they would send Al-Qaeda suspects for torture, the National Review editor Richard Lowry bellowed the Turks. Host John McLaughlin shouted out the Filipinos. Adding academic gravitas to the media swagger, Harvard Law professor Ellen M. Dershowitz told CBS Television's popular 60 Minutes that torture was inevitable. If you got a ticking bomb case, the case of the terrorists who knew precisely where and when the bomb would go off, and it was the only way of saving 500 or 1,000 lives, every democratic society would have and will use torture. Writing in the LA Times, Dershowitz argued that judges should be allowed to use torture warrants for non-lethal pressure in a ticking bomb case when a captured terrorist who knows of an imminent large-scale threat refuses to disclose it. Elaborating on these views in a book several months later, Dershowitz cited the life-saving information that the Manila police beat out of Murad to argue that torture can sometimes prevent harm to civilians. Reviewing the book for the New Republic, federal judge Richard A. Posner cited this telling example from Manila to argue that civil rights are no more than a point of balance between public safety and personal liberty. When the balance is tipped by a ticking nuclear bomb in Times Square, then the judge ruled torture should be used. But Dershowitz's Harvard colleague Philip B. Hayman, a former deputy attorney general, challenged the chimera of limited judicially controlled torture, saying judges would prove indiscriminate and torture will spread, compromising international support of our beliefs. In retrospect, the public's silence greeting this media chatter suggests that the American people were willing to consider and then quietly condone torture as a weapon in the war on terror. Yet, and here's the key part, this enthusiasm for harsh methods seems founded on misinformation and more deeply on an ignorance of torture's complex trajectory. In fact, as the Washington Post reported in the midst of the media debate, the Manila police got all of the important information from Murad in the first few minutes when they seized his laptop with the bomb plot and evidence that led the FBI to World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Ahmed Yusuf in Pakistan. Most of the supposed details gained from the 67 days of torture that followed were, as one Filipino officer testified in New York, police fabrications that Murad mined to end the pain. In weighing personal liberty versus public safety, the pro-pain pundits were also ignorant of torture's perverse pathology, which leads to both the uncontrolled proliferation of the practice and long-term damage to the perpetrator's society. In advocating torture, moreover, These American commentators seemed utterly unaware of the CIA's long history of torture and thus had no inkling that they were reactivating a ruthless apparatus that had only recently been restrained. So, that was the Philippines case to which Brittany made reference. So here we have this once again in an article where they're arguing that in fact torture works, and maintaining the Philippines case was a real instance of the ticking bomb scenario, and that torture succeeded in that case. Hence, they go on to examine what Israel, which is constantly subject to the ticking bomb scenario, permits. First, it permits psychological torture. However, it eliminated the practice of shaking, which could lead to spinal injuries and brain damage, and has resulted in one known death. Israel denies the allegation that it has used torture indiscriminately. The Israeli High Court of Justice maintained that no government official is permitted to use interrogation methods other than those employed by police officers. The court also prohibited the use of a hood, but not other means of limiting eye contact. It did not rule out sleep deprivation per se, but not for long periods for purposes of breaking the suspect. The court allows the use of physical duress where authorities have reason to believe that the ticking time bomb exists. In Ireland v. the United Kingdom, the court held that hooding, subjecting the suspect to noise, sleep deprivation, or deprivation of food and drink, none of these constituted torture. As to the United States interrogation methods, the Army took the position in 2001 that the use of scenarios in which the victim believes his own death or the death of his loved one is imminent is actually okie dokie. Clearly a threat of imminent death includes waterboarding, as we've already said. This of course is already problematic because in fact, while waterboarding does not necessarily result in death, in fact it has resulted in a number of deaths over time. As we know, Dershowitz defends the ticking bomb scenario, which he argues is akin to self-defense. In the author's view, it must only be used where a real ticking bomb exists and not as a catch-all. Further, it must be under the oversight of the head of security services. As we also know, the Bybee memo clearly permitted torture, and he now sits on the bench of the Ninth Circuit. This and other memos had an impact on both soldiers in the field and detainees. And here is the interesting part I think is somewhat curious, because this is where they draw the line, because in the author's view, the Bybee memo was reprehensible because it led to Abu Ghraib. The president's claim that those soldiers caught in the Abu Ghraib net were merely bad apples was plainly disingenuous when the administration encouraged torture, and as we also said before, what happened in Abu Ghraib was necessarily directed by people who actually had knowledge of Muslim culture. Moreover, what happened at Abu Ghraib, okay, as I've said, was clearly orchestrated. Clearly, every method used involved violation of Islamic religious belief, and while the pain was mental, it nonetheless clearly constituted torture. The authors regard the ticking bomb scenario as a legitimate reason for the use of torture, but they provided there really is one. Question Dershowitz's argument for it on legal, moral, and operational grounds. What they are most distressed by is that the president hid behind plausible deniability, leaving young soldiers in the field demoralized and debilitated. Basically, they were used as the fall guys. They were under an obligation to give clear direction and take the heat for it if need be. So if you were going to say, as happened in the Milgram experiments, I'm going to take responsibility, if there's fallout for this, then you actually need to take responsibility. Finally, they acknowledge that detainees will tell the torturer whatever they think the torturer wants to hear to stop the pain. Therefore, from an operational perspective, it is problematic because limited resources can then be misdirected. That is to say that the police or other resources are looking one place for the bomb when in fact it is in quite another place. So if you are, if you finally do give up information, but you intentionally give up false information, that actually would be worse than not engaging in torture at all, because now you're looking for a bunch of for bombs somewhere where they actually are not, so that you won't look for bombs having used other investigative techniques somewhere where they actually are. Finally, I don't think I assigned the O'Connell article. Let's see. No. Okay, so the O'Connell article, I have assigned it in previous years. I didn't assign it this year. And what's important about it is it asks the question about the legal case against the global war on terror. O'Connell argues that the global war on terror should not be deemed war at all. This is, of course, not the first time we've raised this issue. It is her argument that terrorists should be treated as common criminals rather than enemy combatants. Obviously, the third possibility is that an entirely different international legal regime needs to be established to address terrorism in light of the uniqueness of the form of armed struggle. Clearly, and I think this is important to note, who uses terrorism to begin with? Who is drawn to terrorism as an instrument of warfare? To the degree one can even describe it as that.
Ousted groups or neglected individuals? Harassed individuals?
I'm sorry, Brittany, I wasn't hearing you. Say again?
I said ousted groups or like neglected and or harassed individuals.
Okay. So would you describe these as people who are operating from a position of strength?
Definitely not.
So these are actually people who are in some way in some weakened position and who perceive terrorism as the only means to carry on a war, again, if that is what you want to describe it as. So, unlike a state with armies, there is, as we know, no clear cessation of hostilities. What is true is that from an international perspective, we may address the question of punishment. Neither human rights nor humanitarian law permits the use of torture. Further, by moving the question of the Gitmo detainees into the federal courts of the U.S., the constitutional prohibition against cruel and inhuman punishment also comes into play. And I think it is fair to say that if you are a federal authority and you are using torture against your detainees, then surely that must constitute cruel and inhuman punishment. So believe it or not, we were actually 20 minutes ahead because I took very short breaks. So is there anything anybody wanted to say before we call it a day? Danielle.
Let me think. Out of the articles that we read,
Mm-hmm.
one of them, let me see which one. Sorry, I'm just trying to see. You already went over it. The one, Greer and Page. I was thinking, since a lot of the other articles kind of went over the reasons why the ticking bomb is, based on a false reality. If this is a prominent view, the one in the Page article, where that this is like a legitimate reason.
And of course that the Philippines example is an example of a real ticking bomb scenario. Go on.
Right. So I'm just wondering if this is kind of a minority view, or if this is something that a lot of scholars or do other scholars hold this view, or does this seem to be the minority?
Well, I think that, apart from Alan Dershowitz, I'm unaware, although I'm sure I could look it up and find some contrary evidence, but it's my perception that generally speaking, legal scholars would say, yes, this is in violation of the law. Again, I would have to go and do a LexisNexis search and see if there are other advocates among lawyers currently that it's legal. But what I do think, of course, is interesting, and what McCoy discusses in that piece that I read, that plainly it is a broadly held view that it is legitimate, and of course, in the statistics that the article on with the statistics on the current American public view, it's a broadly held view among Americans that it's perfectly legitimate, and I think that most people think in terms of the ticking bomb scenario.
Yeah, I think that's a problem too, and I think that's why a lot of Americans think it's okay, because they think it's in these extreme circumstances where they're stopping a bomb going off in Times Square, and I wonder if there's a way to
Disinform them?
Yeah.
Or not disinform them, I should say, reinform them as to what the truth of the matter is.
Yeah, because it seems like it seems like a lot of people have, refuted that argument, but why it isn't reaching the American public, seems beyond me. But I guess the Bush
Well, first of all, I think that most people, Brittany talked about all of these things coming up on TV, and also, of course, what again was the name of the movie that supposedly led to the capture of Osama bin Laden?
Zero Dark 30.
Right. I mean, I don't think that most Americans are going to sit down and read legal arguments, right?
Right.
And if overwhelmingly the media appears to support it, even liberal media, and if we are, repeatedly shown TV programs and movies that support it, then, what would one expect the American public to? What conclusion would one expect the American public to draw?
Right. I guess to a certain point, it kind of not legitimizes the practices, but I feel like unless there's change in public opinion, as far as the war on terror goes, administrations will be able to keep making exceptions to, why they aren't following the rules of, international law. So,
Uh-huh.
I don't know, it seems
Well,
like,
and I also think we should underscore here, and Brittany, coming from a more conservative background, would undoubtedly agree that anything that brings into question the fullness of the sovereignty of the United States to make its own decisions is always, rejected. Wouldn't you agree, Brittany?
Yeah, definitely. And I heard,
So,
I don't think it was in your class, I think it was on the left wing, when they talk about how Republicans need to see a manly government, whereas Democrats tend to see a more feminine, where they want to take care of the poor, and they want to, they provide,
so all Democrats are girls?
No. A form of government in a feminine way, like taking care of the poor, taking care of humanitarian intervention.
So a nurturing government.
Right. And whereas Republicans need to see this masculine, militaristic form of government, and torture seems to be a part of that.
But the point I think that McCoy makes is that in fact liberals were also supporting the use of torture. So where did we go awry? And of course everybody cited this false case of the Philippines and how information was gotten from this victim in the Philippines. So it's got to be more than just, we're Republicans over Democrats, apparently.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think what the book makes obvious is this was birthed out of this time of terror, the Cold War, and now that it's reviving with the war on terror, torture is being excused again, instead of actively fought against.
And back to Danielle, I said something about sovereignty. I mean, there's a huge resistance to being bound by international law, even to the point of denying that international law exists, because the perception is, and I do think in this case this is a more conservative view, the perception is that, the United States will not be limited by international law because that undermines its sovereign independence. Would you agree with that, Brittany?
No, yes, definitely. I mean, that's the reason why the United States wouldn't sign the treaty on disability rights, something that that everyone expected to pass through, because it was the world telling the U.S. what to do, and that was found to be unacceptable.
Does that seem foolish?
Absolutely.
Is it necessarily true that merely by signing a human rights convention that you have suddenly lost control over your sovereignty? Hi, look, my kitty's coming out.
Definitely not, especially when we argue otherwise for every other country in the world.
So you think there's a bit of hypocrisy there?
Yes, absolutely. We're the ones that typically create and push these conventions, like, for instance, the one on landmines that we talked about, and then we back out at the last second.
Didn't we not sign the CEDAW treaty either? The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women? I think the U.S. didn't sign
I
that.
am pretty sure you're right. Brittany, do you know offhand?
I think that was true as well. I can double check.
I know for sure we are not, in fact, party to the Children's Convention. Pretty sure we're also not party to CEDAW.
Yeah. Isn't the Children's Convention one of the most widespread, like...
Only one other state has not signed, and that's Somalia.
Oh, right.
Officially, the U.S. has not ratified CEDAW.
Yeah.
Oh, you just looked it up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did we sign it? Because signature is a precondition to ratification. So we signed it, but we didn't ratify it.
I'm seeing sorry, I'm trying to find. It's just everything always says the U.S. has not ratified.
Well, the reason why it's of interest whether we signed it is because technically, during that period from signature to ratification, you are more or less bound by the convention anyway, because having signed it, you would not be acting in good faith if you acted inconsistently with its provisions having signed it.
We did sign it when it was first produced in 1980.
1980.
Yes.
Wow. Let's see, how many years does that make? 36?
Yeah.
In 36 years, we couldn't decide to ratify it.
And we're only one of 2 countries that have not ratified it. Of the ones that, of the participants, we're only one of 2 that have not signed it. Or ratified it, sorry.
So who else hasn't ratified it?
The other one is, I always say it wrong. Palau? Palau?
I think that's like an island country, isn't it? Is it?
Yes, yeah.
Wow. Huh, okay, anybody else? Anything they wanted to add to this discussion? Selena, Aisha, either of you?
No, not really.
Oh, come on, you don't have any opinions about torture at all?
I'm sorry, my kids are at home, so I'm a bit I'm too...
Your attention is divided, I get
yeah,
you.
sorry.
And Aisha?
I don't really have anything to add.
So we covered it. Well, good. And we did it in 2 hours, 19 minutes, and 15 seconds. Thank you guys so much. I will see you then again on Friday. As per Brittany's request, I will be writing or working on writing the exam in the coming few days. Hopefully it will be completed by Friday. Worst case scenario, it will be completed by Saturday because I'm still a bit behind on everything. I'm also finishing reading a master's thesis, and I'd like to kind of clean my house today because it's nasty. The other thing, what I wanted to say, Brittany, you're not taking the exam because you're graduating, right?
Right. So you can grade it whenever.
Okay, but what I want to say to anybody who is taking who is graduating, first, please take the earlier exam, and second, please let me know that why you're taking the earlier exam, so that I will go ahead, get it graded in time for graduation, and can post the grades in connection with those individuals who are graduating. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. It was good of you. And what is our next issue
So-
here?
I know the book is Darfur.
Aha, so we're going to be talking about genocide. And I know Brittany, our sick young lady, is going to be all excited about genocide, much the way she's excited about torture, right?
Well, I have started the book, but to clarify, I'm excited because it makes me feel empowered to act against it, you know? Not because...
I'm kidding you, Brittany. You shouldn't take it so seriously, it's a joke.
I've like had that thought several times. Like, am I sick? Like, why do I enjoy studying this? Anyways, it inspires passion to work against.
I agree, but it is one of the things I think that in the long term studying human rights violations, the impact it has is that you start out with this sort of very optimistic view of the world that these things can and should be changed, and then after a while, if you've read enough about all the horrible things humans have done to each other, then you begin to wonder whether there's anything that's worth fixing here. So never get to that place, okay?
I'll try.
Okay, good enough, you guys. Have a good day, and I'll see you Friday, okay?
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye bye. Songlei?